The dawn air hung thick as molasses over Shadowmere Plantation, pregnant with the promise of another suffocating Louisiana day. Ezekiel Mourning stood motionless at the weathered rail of the hog pen, his dark hands gripping the splintered wood with a steadiness that belied the tremor in his soul. The mist clung to his shoulders like the ghosts of the countless mornings he had stood in this very spot, but today carried a weight different from all the others. Today the very air seemed to whisper of endings. The hogs were restless. Their usual morning lethargy had given way to an agitated pacing, their black eyes glinting with an intelligence that made Ezekiel's weathered face twist into something that might have been a smile in another man. On another day, these beasts knew. They sensed what lingered just beyond the veil of the ordinary, what pressed against the boundaries of the world like a storm gathering strength in the distance. 43 years Ezekiel had walked this earth, 37 of them under the boot of Thaddeus Grimwald, and in all that time he had never felt the peculiar calm that now settled over him like a shroud. It was not peace. Peace was a luxury for men whose backs had never felt the kiss of the whip, whose children had never been sold like cattle at market. No, this was something altogether different. This was the terrible serenity that comes to a man when he finally understands his purpose. The plantation house loomed behind him, its white columns stark against the gray sky, each one a monument to suffering built on foundations of bone and blood. Even now he could feel its windows watching him like dead eyes, could sense the malevolent presence that dwelt within those walls, stirring to wakefulness. Grimwald would be rising soon, would be calling for his morning coffee and the newspaper from New Orleans, would be planning another day of the casual cruelties that had become as natural to him as breathing. But today would be different. Today the natural order of things would shift, would bend, would break. Ezekiel's mind drifted unbidden to the previous evening. He had been returning from the fields, his body aching with the familiar symphony of pains that had become his constant companions, when he had heard it, the sound that had finally snapped something deep inside his chest. It was not the crack of the whip, though that sound had long ago lost its power to shock him. It was not even the screams, for screams were as common at Shadowmere as the song of the cicadas in the Spanish moss. No, it was laughter. Grimwald's laughter, rich and full and utterly delighted, drifted from the direction of the quarters where young Temperance Wells lived with her infant daughter. The same laughter Ezekiel had heard when his own wife, Mercy, had been sold downriver to pay for Grimwald's gambling debts. The same laughter that had echoed across the fields when his boy Samuel had been beaten to death for the crime of learning to read. That laughter had followed him into sleep and haunted his dreams, mixing with memories that rose like bile in his throat. He remembered Mercy's hands so gentle when she tended his wounds, so desperate when they were torn from his own as the slave traders dragged her away. He remembered Samuel's eyes, bright with curiosity and hope, growing dim as Grimwald's overseer brought the club down again and again. He remembered Temperance's mother, sweet Lily Wells, found hanging from the old cypress after Grimwald had finished with her, her body swaying in the bayou breeze like some terrible fruit. The hogs grunted and snuffled, their massive bodies pressing against the pen's far side as if sensing his thoughts. They were enormous creatures, these swamp hogs, fed on the refuse of the plantation and grown fat as barrels on a diet of scraps and slop. Grimwald took pride in them, in their size and their voracious appetites. Finest hogs in all of Louisiana, he would boast to visitors, never mentioning what it was that made them grow so large, so content. Ezekiel knew, though. He had been the one tasked with feeding them for the past decade, had watched them devour everything thrown into their pen with an efficiency that was almost mechanical. Bones disappeared without a trace. Cloth vanished as if it had never existed, and even the hardest substances seemed to dissolve in their powerful jaws and acidic stomachs. Nothing remained. Nothing at all. The eastern sky was beginning to blush with the first hints of true dawn, and with it would come the plantation's awakening. The other slaves would emerge from their cramped quarters, would shuffle toward the fields with the resigned acceptance of men and women who had long ago surrendered their dreams to the grinding machinery of bondage. The overseers would take their positions, whips coiled at their sides like sleeping serpents, and Grimwald would emerge from his house master of all he surveyed, secure in his dominion over human flesh. But as Ezekiel stood there in the growing light, feeling the weight of decades pressing down on his shoulders, he found himself thinking not of servitude but of stories. Old stories passed down from the elders who remembered Africa, who spoke in whispers of a time when justice was not the province of white courts and black codes, but something altogether more primal. Stories of the natural order, of the way the world balanced itself when men forgot their place in the great wheel of existence. The Hogs had grown quiet now, their dark eyes fixed on him with an attention that was almost human. In that moment, standing at the threshold between night and day, between what was and what would be, Ezekiel felt the last of his doubt drain away like water through sand. He thought of all those who would never see justice in any courtroom, who would find no mercy in any law written by the hands of their oppressors. He thought of Mercy, of Samuel, of Temperance's mother, of countless others whose names had been forgotten by everyone except the earth that held their bones. Perhaps you, dear reader, have never stood at such a crossroads, where the weight of accumulated suffering becomes too great for any single soul to bear. If these tales of justice delayed but not denied speak to something deep within your heart, I invite you to subscribe and comment below. For in sharing these stories, we ensure that the voices of the silenced are never truly forgotten. The sound of a door slamming echoed across the plantation grounds, sharp as a gunshot in the still air. Grimwald was awake, beginning his morning ritual of dominion and control. Soon he would make his rounds, inspect his property, human and otherwise, with the satisfied air of a man who believed the world existed solely for his pleasure. Ezekiel's hand moved to the rope coiled at his belt, his fingers tracing its rough length with the careful attention of a musician, tuning his instrument. He had spent the long hours of the night preparing, had checked and double-checked every knot, every loop. There could be no mistakes, no hesitation. When the moment came, it would have to be perfect. The Hogs began to stir again, sensing perhaps the approach of their morning feeding. They pressed against the wooden rails, their massive heads pushing through the gaps, their eyes fixed on Ezekiel with an expectancy that made his skin crawl. They were hungry, these beasts. They were always hungry. A mockingbird called from the Spanish moss, its voice a liquid trill in the growing light. Somewhere in the distance, a church bell tolled the hour, its bronze voice carrying across the bayou like a benediction or a judgment. The world was waking, stretching toward another day of heat and humidity, and the endless grinding of human hearts beneath the wheel of an unjust world. But not for everyone. Not today. Ezekiel straightened, his spine crackling with the effort. His reflection caught his eye in the murky water of the Hog's trough, a face mapped with scars, eyes that had seen too much, a mouth that had forgotten how to smile. This was what Grimwald's world had made of him, what 37 years of systematic cruelty had wrought from the hopeful young man who had once believed that goodness would triumph, that justice was more than just a word white men used in their Sunday sermons. The plantation was fully awake now. He could hear the shuffle of feet, the creak of doors, the low murmur of voices resigned to another day of suffering. The overseers would be taking their positions soon, cracking their whips to hurry the workers toward the fields. The machinery of bondage was beginning its daily rotation, as predictable as the sunrise, as inevitable as death, or so it had seemed, until this morning, as Ezekiel stood there, watching the light strengthen and feeling the weight of his resolve settle into his bones like lead. He thought of his grandmother's words. She had been born in Africa, had crossed the terrible water in the belly of a slave ship, had lived to see 3 generations of her family scattered to the winds like leaves before a storm. But she had never lost her faith in the old ways, in the belief that the world would eventually balance itself, that cruelty would find its answer in the natural order of things. Every action, she used to whisper to him when he was small, her ancient hands gentle on his fevered brow when the overseer's whip had marked him. Every action finds its echo in the world, child. The cruel man plants seeds of cruelty, and one day, one way or another, he will taste the harvest. The Hogs were grunting now, a low, expectant sound that seemed to vibrate through the very ground. Soon, very soon, it would be time to feed them, but not with the usual slop and scraps. Today they would taste something altogether different. Today, they would become the instruments of a justice that no court would ever recognize, no law would ever sanction. Ezekiel closed his eyes and felt the last of his humanity drain away, leaving behind something harder, something necessary. When he opened them again, the sun had cleared the horizon, painting the world in shades of gold and shadow. It was going to be a beautiful day. The Hogs were waiting. Thaddeus Grimwald emerged from Shadowmere's imposing front doors like a king surveying his realm, his pale eyes sweeping across the morning vista with the satisfied air of a man who had never questioned his right to own other human beings. At 52, he carried himself with the casual arrogance that came from 3 decades of absolute power over hundreds of souls, his soft hands unmarked by labor, his corpulent frame testament to a life built on the sweat and blood of others. The plantation house itself seemed to exhale malevolence in the growing heat, its white columns streaked with moisture that ran like tears down the painted wood. Built by his father in 1803 on land purchased with money made from selling families apart, Shadowmere had grown fat and prosperous under 2 generations of Grimwald cruelty. The house sprawled across the landscape like some pale cancer, its wings and additions marking each profitable year, each successful harvest wrung from reluctant earth by unwilling hands. Inside, the rooms were caverns of shadow and oppression, filled with furniture carved from cypress trees that had once sheltered runaway slaves. The walls absorbed sound strangely, seeming to swallow screams while amplifying whispers, as if the very structure had learned to keep its master's secrets. Heavy velvet drapes blocked out the Louisiana sun, creating a perpetual twilight that matched Grimwald's soul, while portraits of his ancestors gazed down from their gilded frames with eyes that held the same cold calculation that marked their descendants. Grimwald's morning ritual was as fixed as the movements of the stars. Coffee first, brought by trembling hands on his grandmother's china, the cup never quite full enough, the temperature never exactly right, providing convenient excuses for the casual backhands that sent servants sprawling across the polished floors. Then the newspaper from New Orleans, its pages filled with advertisements for runaway slaves and notices of upcoming auctions, which he read with the same interest other men might reserve for commodity prices or shipping schedules. But this morning held a special pleasure, one that had kept him wakeful through the small hours, planning and savoring the anticipation. Young Temperance Wells had caught his attention, just as her mother had 20 years before, and just as her grandmother had in the previous generation. The Grimwalds had a particular fondness for the Wells women, finding in their beauty and spirit a challenge that made the inevitable breaking all the sweeter. The parallels were not lost on him. Lily Wells had possessed the same proud bearing, the same defiant flash in her dark eyes, the same protective fury when it came to her child. She had resisted the longest of all the women on the plantation, had endured punishments that would have broken lesser spirits, had clung to her dignity, even as he systematically stripped away everything else. In the end, of course, she had chosen the rope over continued submission, but not before providing him with years of exquisite entertainment. Now it was Temperance's turn, and the girl showed every sign of possessing her mother's stubborn pride. She had already begun to pull away when he approached, had developed the habit of keeping her infant daughter close as if her maternal presence could somehow shield them both from what was inevitable. Such delicious futility only added spice to the game. Grimwald settled into his leather chair on the veranda, his bulk causing the wood to creak in protest. From here he could see the entirety of his domain, the endless rows of cotton stretching toward the bayou, the ramshackle quarters where his property slept, the various outbuildings that housed the machinery of bondage, and there, at the edge of his vision, the hog pen where that useful creature Ezekiel Mourning went about his morning duties. Ezekiel had proven surprisingly durable over the years, had absorbed punishment that would have killed weaker men, while maintaining just enough functionality to remain profitable. There was something almost admirable about his persistence, the way he continued to draw breath despite every reasonable expectation to the contrary. Grimwald had taken particular pleasure in breaking him piece by piece. First the wife, sold to cover gambling debts that could easily have been paid from petty cash. Then the boy who had shown dangerous signs of intelligence. Finally, the extended family members who had provided what little comfort remained in the man's existence. Yet still Ezekiel endured, still rose each morning to feed the hogs and tend the gardens, still performed his duties with mechanical precision, despite the death that lived behind his eyes. It was almost supernatural, this capacity for survival, and Grimwald found himself oddly grateful for it. A man needed worthy opponents to make life interesting, needed challenges that tested his skills at inflicting precisely calibrated suffering. The morning air carried the sound of voices from the quarters, the low murmur of people preparing for another day of unpaid labor. Soon the overseers would begin their rounds, would crack their whips to drive the workers toward the fields where they would spend the daylight hours bent over cotton plants, their fingers bleeding from the sharp bowls, their backs aching under the relentless sun. It was a sight that never failed to satisfy Grimwald's soul, this daily demonstration of his absolute power over human life. A mockingbird trilled from the Spanish moss, its voice liquid and sweet in the growing heat. The sound reminded him of his childhood, of mornings spent following his father through the plantation as the older man explained the finer points of human management. Those had been formative years, watching as his father demonstrated the delicate balance between too little punishment and too much, learning to read the subtle signs that indicated when a slave was approaching the breaking point, and understanding the economics of cruelty. Never kill them outright, his father had counseled, his voice carrying the weight of hard-won experience. Dead slaves produce no cotton, but never let them forget who holds their lives in his hands. The art is in keeping them just broken enough to be useful, just hopeful enough to keep trying, just desperate enough to do anything to protect what little they have left. It was a philosophy that had served 3 generations of Grimwalds well, had built this empire of suffering from nothing more than raw ambition and a willingness to see other humans as livestock. The key was in understanding that physical pain, while necessary, was crude and temporary. True control came from attacking the soul, from identifying what each individual slave valued most and then systematically destroying it, while leaving them alive to mourn the loss. The sound of footsteps on gravel drew his attention, and he smiled to see his current overseer, Jeremiah Hooks, approaching with the day's reports. Hooks was a man perfectly suited to his profession, blessed with a complete lack of imagination and a casual brutality that required no instruction. He had worked plantations from Mississippi to Georgia, had earned his reputation through a willingness to do whatever was necessary to maintain order among the slaves. "Morning, Mr. Grimwald," Hooks said, touching the brim of his hat in a gesture of deference that fooled neither of them. The overseer understood his position in the plantation's hierarchy, higher than the slaves, lower than the master, existing in that gray space where violence was both a tool and entertainment. "The inventory, Hooks? All accounted for, sir. Though we lost another one of the field hands during the night. Natural causes, looks like. Old Moses finally gave up the ghost." Grimwald nodded absently. Moses had been ancient when his father acquired him, had somehow survived decades of labor that should have killed him years ago. His death was overdue rather than surprising, though it would mean replacing him before the next planting season. "And the special project I mentioned?" Hook's scarred face split into what might have been a grin on a more human countenance. "The Wells girl? She's been moved to the house like you requested. Get her installed in the room next to the kitchen, where she'll be convenient for household duties." The euphemism hung in the air between them, understood and appreciated. Temperance would resist, of course, they always did initially. But resistance was half the pleasure, the seasoning that made eventual submission all the sweeter. Her mother had fought for months before accepting her fate, and had provided entertainment through the long winter evenings when outdoor diversions were scarce. If you find yourself drawn into this tale of power and its terrible consequences, of a world where human dignity was bought and sold like any other commodity, please take a moment to subscribe and comment below. These stories of historical horror remind us why we must never forget the capacity for both evil and justice that dwells within the human heart. Grimwald's thoughts were interrupted by movement near the hog pen. Ezekiel was going about his morning routine, distributing slop to the massive beasts with the same mechanical precision he brought to all his tasks. There was something almost soothing about watching the man work, something that spoke to the natural order of things, the master comfortable in his chair, the slave bent to his labor. The world arranged exactly as God and nature intended. The hogs themselves were magnificent specimens, the pride of the plantation. Grimwald had spent years perfecting their diet, had discovered through careful experimentation exactly what combination of feeds would produce the largest, most voracious animals. They were gluttons without equal, capable of devouring virtually anything thrown into their pen, their powerful jaws and acidic stomachs breaking down materials that would challenge even the hungriest predators. Visitors to Shadowmere always remarked on the hog's size and apparent contentment, never guessing what it was that made them so eager to consume whatever was offered. Grimwald took particular pride in their efficiency, in the way they left no trace of whatever disappeared into their pen. It was a useful quality in creatures that occasionally served purposes beyond simple pork production. The sun was climbing higher now, painting the plantation in shades of gold and green that would have been beautiful to eyes unencumbered by the knowledge of what human suffering had purchased this pastoral scene. Cotton stretched to the horizon, white bowls gleaming like scattered pearls against the dark earth. Soon the slaves would be bent among those plants, their hands working to gather the crop that would purchase another year of comfort for their master, another season of absolute power over human flesh. Grimwald allowed himself a moment of pure satisfaction, savoring the weight of his dominion, the knowledge that hundreds of souls existed solely for his benefit. This was what his grandfather had dreamed of when he first set foot in Louisiana, what his father had built with determination and careful cruelty, what he himself had perfected through decades of systematic brutalization. The mockingbird fell silent, perhaps sensing some shift in the morning air. Even the hogs had grown quiet, their usual grunting reduced to an expectant murmur that seemed to vibrate through the ground itself. Somewhere in the distance, a church bell tolled the hour, its bronze voice carrying across the bayou like a reminder that even in this place of shadows, time continued its relentless march toward whatever judgment awaited. But Grimwald felt no concern, no shadow of doubt about his choices or their consequences. He was master here, lord of all he surveyed, answerable to no authority save his own desires. The slaves existed for his pleasure, the overseers for his convenience, the very land itself for his profit. This was the natural order, sanctioned by law and custom, blessed by churches that preached the divine right of some men to own others. Nothing could challenge that order. Nothing could threaten his absolute control. As the morning heat began to build, as the plantation stirred to full wakefulness around him, Thaddeus Grimwald settled deeper into his chair and began to plan the day's entertainment. There would be the usual business of cotton and commerce, the mundane details of running a profitable enterprise. But there would also be time for more personal pleasures, for the careful application of power that made life worth living. Time to begin Temperance Wells's education in the realities of her position. Time to remind his human property why resistance was futile. Time to feed the hogs. The transformation had begun 3 nights earlier, though Ezekiel would not recognize it as such until the moment when his last thread of humanity finally snapped like an overstretched rope. He had been returning from the evening feeding of the hogs, his body moving with the automatic precision of a man who had performed the same tasks for so many years. That thought was no longer required, when the sound reached him through the humid air like a physical blow. It was Temperance Wells, screaming. Not the sharp cry of surprise or pain that occasionally echoed across the plantation grounds, not the wail of grief that marked another small death in the quarters, but something altogether different. This was the sound of a soul being systematically dismantled piece by piece with surgical precision. It was the same sound her mother had made in those final weeks before she chose the rope. The same sound that had accompanied the breaking of dozens of women who had caught Grimwald's particular attention over the years. Ezekiel had stopped in his tracks, his weathered hands still gripping the empty slop bucket, as that sound cut through him like a blade. In that moment, standing in the gathering dusk with the Spanish moss hanging like funeral shrouds from the ancient oaks, he felt something fundamental shift inside his chest. It was not anger. Anger was an emotion he had buried long ago, along with hope and love and all the other luxuries that slaves could not afford. This was something colder, more calculating, infinitely more dangerous. The screaming stopped abruptly, replaced by the kind of silence that spoke of exhaustion rather than relief. Ezekiel knew that silence well, having heard it follow his wife's cries when Grimwald had taken his pleasures with her in those final weeks before the sale. It was the silence of a spirit learning to retreat deeper inside itself, seeking some internal sanctuary where violation could not reach. He had stood there for a long time, feeling the Louisiana heat press against his skin like a living thing, feeling the weight of 37 years of accumulated suffering settle into his bones like lead. Around him, the plantation continued its evening ritual. Slaves returning from the fields, overseers heading to their quarters, the great house settling into its nightly routine of comfort built on the foundation of human misery. But something had changed. Something irreversible had occurred in that moment when Temperance's scream pierced the night air, and Ezekiel found himself thinking not of submission and endurance, but of other things entirely. Darker things. Necessary things. The next morning he had watched Grimwald emerge from the house with his usual self-satisfied air, and had observed the way the man's pale eyes lingered on the quarters where Temperance had been moved. There was anticipation in that gaze, the look of a predator savoring the hunt. It was an expression Ezekiel had seen countless times over the decades, and had learned to read like a farmer reads the sky for signs of approaching storms. But this time, instead of the familiar despair that such sights usually brought, Ezekiel felt only a strange, cold clarity. For the first time in his adult life, he was not thinking like a slave. He was thinking like something else entirely. The second night brought fresh screams, longer this time, punctuated by Grimwald's laughter echoing across the plantation grounds like the sound of breaking glass. Ezekiel lay on his rough pallet in the quarters, staring up at the ceiling where shadows danced in the light of the dying fire, and felt the last of his restraints crumble into dust. He thought of Temperance's infant daughter, barely 6 months old, sleeping fitfully in the cabin next to his own. What future awaited that child? What lessons would she learn about her place in Grimwald's world? Would she grow up to suffer the same fate as her mother, her grandmother, the endless line of Wells women who had been consumed by the appetites of Grimwald men? The questions burned in his mind like acid, eating away at the careful barriers he had constructed over the years to contain his rage. But more than rage, he felt a kind of mathematical certainty settling over him. The equation was simple. Grimwald would continue his depredations as long as he drew breath. The law would never touch him. God seemed indifferent to the suffering of slaves. The only variable that could change the outcome was action, direct action. The third night had brought no screams at all, which was somehow worse than the sounds of agony that had preceded it. Ezekiel knew what that silence meant, having seen it before in the aftermath of Grimwald's attention. Temperance had reached the point her mother had eventually found, the place where resistance became impossible, and the spirit retreated so deep inside itself that it might never fully emerge again. It was then, standing at his small window and staring out at the great house where such horrors transpired with casual regularity, that Ezekiel made his decision. Not in a moment of passion or fury, but with the cold deliberation of a man calculating the most efficient route between 2 points. The problem was clear, the solution obvious. The only remaining question one of method and timing. He had spent the remaining hours of that night in careful thought, his mind turning over possibilities with mechanical precision. Violence was nothing new at Shadowmere. Slaves died regularly from overwork, disease, and the casual brutalities that marked their daily existence. But their deaths were always investigated, however perfunctorily, and the perpetrators sometimes faced consequences if the profit margins were threatened. Grimwald's death would be different. It would be examined closely, and would bring unwanted attention from authorities who might ask uncomfortable questions about the plantation's operations. The method would need to be careful, untraceable, capable of eliminating not just the man but any evidence that might point to deliberate action. The Hogs had been the obvious answer. For 10 years, Ezekiel had fed those beasts twice daily, had observed their voracious appetites and complete lack of discrimination about what they consumed. He had seen them devour everything from spoiled vegetables to diseased livestock, had watched them reduce the largest bones to splinters, and had marveled at their ability to digest materials that would poison other animals. Nothing fed to the Hogs ever reappeared. Nothing left any trace. Grimwald himself had often remarked on this quality, and had taken pride in his animals' efficiency. Feed them anything, he would boast to visitors, and they'll make it disappear like it never existed. The irony of those words had not been lost on Ezekiel as he formulated his plan. The practical details had fallen into place with surprising ease. Grimwald's morning routine was as predictable as sunrise, his vanity requiring him to inspect his domain personally, rather than relying on overseer reports. He walked the same path each day, pausing at the same locations, following patterns established by years of habit. The hog pen was always included in these rounds, as Grimwald enjoyed displaying his prize animals to whatever audience was available. More importantly, the pen was isolated, surrounded by dense vegetation that would muffle sound and screen activity from casual observation. The nearest building was the tool shed, unused except during specific work periods. The overseers rarely ventured in that direction during morning hours, preferring to concentrate their efforts on organizing the field hands for the day's labor. The rope had been easy to acquire. As the plantation's unofficial handyman, Ezekiel had access to all manner of tools and supplies, could requisition whatever materials he needed without arousing suspicion. A few coils of hemp rope, ostensibly for repairing fence lines, had joined his modest collection of personal possessions without comment. But beyond the practical considerations lay something deeper, something that spoke to the very foundation of justice itself. There was a symmetry to his plan that appealed to Ezekiel's sense of cosmic balance. Grimwald had built his fortune by treating human beings as livestock, by reducing men and women to the status of animals to be bought, sold, bred, and slaughtered at will. How fitting that he should end his life in the belly of actual beasts, should experience firsthand what it meant to be consumed by forces beyond his control. Perhaps you have never contemplated the moment when a human soul reaches its absolute limit, when the accumulated weight of injustice becomes too great for any moral framework to contain. These stories of ordinary people pushed beyond the boundaries of what should be endurable remind us why vigilance against oppression is essential. If these tales resonate with your understanding of justice deferred but not denied, please subscribe and comment below. The fourth morning had dawned gray and oppressive, the air thick with the promise of another scorching day. Ezekiel had risen before first light, had spent the pre-dawn hours in final preparation, checking his work with the obsessive care of a craftsman perfecting his masterpiece. The rope lay coiled and ready, each knot tested and retested, each loop measured with mathematical precision. As he stood at the hog pen in the growing light, watching the massive beast stir to wakefulness, Ezekiel felt the last of his old self slip away like a discarded garment. The man who had endured 37 years of systematic brutalization, who had absorbed every cruelty with stoic acceptance, who had clung to the fading hope that goodness might eventually triumph, that man was gone. In his place stood something new, something born from the ashes of accumulated suffering, and forged in the fires of absolute despair. This new being felt no fear, no hesitation, no doubt about the righteousness of what was to come. It understood with crystalline clarity that some actions transcended conventional morality, that certain situations demanded responses that existed outside the normal framework of right and wrong. The hogs were growing restless now, sensing the approach of their morning feeding. They pressed against the pen's wooden rails, their small eyes glittering with anticipation, their massive bodies radiating a patient hunger that had become as familiar to Ezekiel as his own heartbeat. Soon they would be fed, but not with the usual slop and scraps. Today they would feast on something altogether more substantial. The sound of the great house stirring reached him across the plantation grounds, doors opening, voices calling, the machinery of another day beginning its relentless operation. Grimwald would be rising now, would be beginning his morning ritual of coffee and newspapers, would be planning another day of casual cruelties and systematic oppression. But his plans would not survive the morning. Ezekiel's transformation was complete now, the metamorphosis from victim to agent of retribution, accomplished in the space between one heartbeat and the next. When he turned away from the hog pen to begin the final preparations, his movements carried a purpose that had been absent for decades. Every step was deliberate, every gesture calculated, every breath drawn in service of a justice that no court would ever recognize. The natural order was about to be restored, the cosmic balance adjusted, the ancient law of consequence finally given its due. Grimwald had sown the wind with his cruelties, had planted seeds of suffering in soil watered by innocent tears. Today, at last, he would reap the whirlwind. The hogs were waiting. The morning of the fifth day dawned with a peculiar stillness that seemed to press against the Louisiana landscape like a held breath. Even the ever-present cicadas had fallen silent, their usual drone replaced by an expectant quiet that made the air itself feel heavy with portent. Ezekiel moved through his preparations with the methodical precision of a man who had rehearsed every gesture until it became as natural as breathing, each action flowing seamlessly into the next like notes in a carefully composed symphony. The rope lay coiled beneath a pile of old burlap sacks in the tool shed, its rough hemp fibers already shaped into the configurations that would be needed when the moment arrived. He had spent hours in the darkness perfecting each knot, testing the strength of every loop, ensuring that when the time came there would be no hesitation, no fumbling with unfamiliar equipment. The work had been almost meditative, the repetitive motions serving to focus his mind and quiet the last whispers of doubt that might have interfered with what was necessary. Grimwald's routine had not varied in the slightest over the past 4 days of observation. Each morning he emerged from the great house at precisely 7:15, coffee cup in hand, newspaper tucked under his arm, pale eyes already scanning his domain for signs of inefficiency or insubordination. He would spend 20 minutes on the veranda, reading and drinking while surveying the stirring plantation, then begin his morning rounds with the self-satisfied air of a king inspecting his realm. The path was always the same. First to the stables to check on his riding horses, then to the cotton gin to examine the previous day's output, followed by a swing past the slave quarters to ensure that all his human property was accounted for and ready for work. The hog pen came last in this circuit, positioned at the farthest edge of his morning walk, where the dense growth of cypress and Spanish moss created a natural screen from the rest of the plantation. It was there, in that isolated corner where the cultivated world gave way to the wild tangle of the bayou, that Ezekiel would be waiting. The hogs themselves seemed to sense that this day was different from all others. Their usual morning lethargy had given way to a restless energy that kept them moving constantly around their pen, their massive bodies creating small tremors in the earth as they paced. Their eyes, normally dull with the stupor of constant feeding, now gleamed with an alertness that was almost human in its intensity. They pressed against the wooden rails with unusual insistence, their snouts testing the air as if detecting some scent that promised better fare than their customary slop. Ezekiel found their behavior oddly comforting. It suggested that even the beasts could sense the approaching shift in the natural order, and could feel the weight of justice pressing down upon the plantation like an approaching storm. There was something deeply satisfying about this cosmic alignment, this convergence of purpose between man and animal in service of a greater equilibrium. The morning progressed with agonizing slowness, each minute stretching like an hour as Ezekiel went through the motions of his regular duties. He fed the chickens with mechanical precision, tended the vegetable garden with his usual care, and repaired a section of fence that had been damaged in the previous night's storm. To any observer, he appeared to be simply another slave going about his assigned tasks, exhibiting the same resigned efficiency that had marked his behavior for decades. But beneath this facade of normalcy, every nerve was alive with anticipation. His awareness had sharpened to an almost supernatural degree, allowing him to track the movements of every person on the plantation with the precision of a hunter monitoring his prey. He knew where each overseer was positioned, could predict the timing of their rounds, and had calculated exactly how long he would have. Before his absence might be noticed, the other slaves went about their morning preparations with the usual subdued energy of people facing another day of unpaid labor. None of them seemed to sense anything unusual about Ezekiel's demeanor, though several had commented over the past few days about his apparent calmness. Where once his face had been marked by the barely controlled rage that simmered just beneath the surface of every plantation slave, now there was only a serene acceptance that some interpreted as spiritual resignation. They could not have been more wrong. At 6:30, Ezekiel made his way to the tool shed under the pretense of collecting materials for fence repair. The morning was already growing warm, the humid air thick with the scent of magnolia and the underlying rot that always seemed to permeate the bayou. Inside the dim confines of the shed, surrounded by the accumulated implements of plantation maintenance, he retrieved the rope from its hiding place and coiled it carefully around his waist, concealing it beneath his loose work shirt. The weight of it against his body felt like a benediction, a tangible reminder of the power he was about to claim. For so many years he had felt powerless, had endured every humiliation and cruelty with the stoic acceptance that was expected of his kind. But the rope represented something different. Agency, choice, the ability to act rather than simply endure. It transformed him from victim to participant, from slave to architect of his own destiny. As he emerged from the shed, Ezekiel caught sight of Temperance Wells sitting outside her cabin, her infant daughter cradled in her arms. The young woman's face bore the hollow expression that had become familiar to him over the past few days, the look of someone whose spirit had retreated so far inside itself that only the most basic functions remained accessible. Her daughter fussed quietly, sensing perhaps the distress that radiated from her mother like heat from a fever. The sight strengthened Ezekiel's resolve, reminding him that this was not merely about revenge but about breaking a cycle that had consumed generations of the innocent. How many other young women would suffer Temperance's fate if Grimwald were allowed to continue his depredations? How many other children would grow up in the shadow of his cruelties? The mathematics of prevention was stark and undeniable. If you find yourself questioning the moral boundaries that separate justice from vengeance, if these glimpses into the darkest corners of human behavior compel you to consider what you might do when pushed beyond all reasonable limits, please take a moment to subscribe and comment below. These stories of historical horror remind us that ordinary people, when subjected to extraordinary circumstances, are capable of both great evil and terrible necessity. By 7 o'clock, Ezekiel had positioned himself near the hog pen, ostensibly engaged in the mundane task of checking the fence posts for signs of rot or damage. The location provided perfect concealment among the dense foliage, while offering clear sightlines to the path Grimwald would take during his morning rounds. The hogs had grown increasingly agitated as the appointed time approached. Their usual grunting elevated to an almost musical chorus that seemed to vibrate through the very ground. The bayou itself appeared to be holding its breath. The Spanish moss hung motionless in the still air, not even the slightest breeze disturbing its funeral draping. The water beyond the plantation's cultivated boundaries lay flat as black glass, reflecting the gray sky with mirror-like precision. Even the usual chorus of birds and insects had fallen silent, as if nature itself understood that something momentous was about to occur. At 7:15 precisely, the great house disgorged its master onto the morning stage. Grimwald appeared in his customary white linen suit, the fabric already beginning to show dark patches where perspiration met the Louisiana humidity. His pale eyes swept across the plantation with proprietary satisfaction, pausing to note the slaves already moving toward their assigned work areas, the overseers taking their positions for another day of enforced productivity. The routine unfolded exactly as Ezekiel had observed for 4 consecutive mornings. Coffee first, consumed while reading selected passages from the New Orleans newspaper aloud to himself, apparently finding great amusement in the advertisements for runaway slaves and the reports of successful auctions. Then the leisurely descent from the veranda, the unhurried pace of a man who owned not only the land he walked upon, but every living creature that drew breath within its boundaries. The stables received their customary inspection, Grimwald running his soft hands along the flanks of his riding horses with the same casual possessiveness he displayed toward his human property. The cotton gin drew his attention next, where he spent several minutes examining the machinery that transformed the labor of his slaves into the cotton that would purchase another year of comfort and dominance. As Grimwald moved toward the slave quarters for his daily inventory of human assets, Ezekiel felt a strange calm settle over him like a mantle. All the preparation, all the careful observation, all the mental rehearsal had led to this moment. There would be no turning back now, no opportunity for second thoughts or moral hesitation. The die had been cast the moment Temperance's screams had pierced the night air 4 days earlier. The hogs seemed to sense the approaching culmination, their movements becoming even more frenzied as the minutes ticked by. They pressed against the wooden rails of their pen with increasing insistence, their small eyes fixed on the path where their morning feeding would soon take on an entirely new significance. Their hunger was palpable, radiating from their massive forms like heat from a forge. Ezekiel checked the rope one final time, ensuring that each loop was properly positioned for rapid deployment. His hands remained steady despite the magnitude of what was about to occur, muscle memory taking precedence over conscious thought. This was no longer about emotion or passion. It had become something far more elemental, a force of nature expressing itself through human agency. The sound of footsteps on gravel announced Grimwald's approach to the final phase of his morning routine. In a few minutes, he would round the bend in the path that led to the hog pen and walk directly into the trap that had been so carefully prepared. There would be no escape, no mercy, no opportunity for the kind of plea bargaining that characterized his usual interactions with those he considered his inferiors. Today, for the first time in his adult life, Thaddeus Grimwald would discover what it felt like to be completely at another man's mercy. The hogs were waiting. Ezekiel was ready. The natural order was about to be restored the moment arrived. With the inexorable precision of a clock striking midnight, each second measured out in the sound of Grimwald's approaching footsteps on the gravel path. Ezekiel remained motionless among the cypress shadows, his breathing so controlled it seemed he had become part of the landscape itself, another piece of the bayou's ancient machinery. The rope lay coiled in his hands like a sleeping serpent, ready to spring to deadly life at his command. Grimwald rounded the final bend in the path with his customary air of absolute authority, his pale eyes already fixed on the hog pen with the satisfied expression of a man surveying his most prized possessions. The massive beasts had grown silent at his approach, their usual grunting replaced by an expectant stillness that should have served as warning to anyone possessed of natural instincts. But Grimwald had long ago severed his connection to such primitive concerns, secure in his belief that the world existed solely for his pleasure and profit. "Morning, my beauties," he called to the hogs, his voice carrying the jovial tone he reserved for his favorite animals. "Ready for your breakfast? Ezekiel will be along shortly with your slop, though I'm thinking today might call for something a bit more substantial." The irony of those words would have been amusing under different circumstances. As it was, they served only to confirm Ezekiel's certainty that the universe itself demanded this correction to the natural order. Even in his ignorance, Grimwald had prophesied his own fate. The plantation owner approached the pen's wooden rail with the casual confidence of a man who had never known fear, who had never experienced the helplessness that defined the existence of those he owned. His soft hands gripped the weathered wood as he leaned forward to better observe his prized swine, completely oblivious to the figure emerging from the shadows behind him with the fluid silence of a hunting cat. The first loop of rope settled around Grimwald's throat before he had time to register the presence behind him. His hands flew to his neck in reflexive panic, fingers clawing at the hemp that was already tightening with mechanical precision. The sound that emerged from his constricted windpipe was less than human, a strangled wheeze that carried all the authority of a dying animal. "Don't struggle." Ezekiel's voice was calm, almost conversational, as if he were offering advice about the weather. "It will only make things worse for you." Grimwald's eyes bulged with the terrible understanding that his world had just inverted completely. For the first time in his adult life, he was not the predator but the prey, not the master but the victim. His legs kicked frantically as Ezekiel dragged him away from the pen's rail, the rope cutting deeper into his flesh with each movement. You can't. This is..." Grimwald's words came in desperate gasps, his mind struggling to process a reality that contradicted everything he had believed about his place in the natural order. "I can," Ezekiel replied with the same terrifying calm. "I am. And there's nothing in heaven or earth that's going to stop me." The struggle that followed was brief and utterly one-sided. Grimwald's soft body, pampered by decades of luxury and idle comfort, proved no match for muscles hardened by 37 years of forced labor. Within minutes, he found himself bound hand and foot, the rope work executed with the precision of a craftsman who had spent countless hours perfecting his technique. As consciousness returned fully to Grimwald's panic-addled mind, he became aware of his position. He lay on his back near the edge of the hog pen, close enough to hear the excited shuffling of the massive beasts as they detected the scent of fear and fresh meat. The wooden rails loomed above him like the bars of a cage, and beyond them, dozens of small black eyes watched with an attention that was disturbingly intelligent. "What do you want?" Grimwald's voice cracked with terror, all traces of his customary authority stripped away like paint in acid rain. "Money? I can give you money. Freedom papers? I can arrange." "Freedom papers," Ezekiel repeated, the words seeming to taste bitter on his tongue. "From the man who sold my wife to pay his gambling debts. From the man who beat my boy to death for learning to read. From the man who spent the last 4 nights breaking Temperance Wells the same way he broke her mother." Each accusation fell like a physical blow, and Grimwald's face went white as he recognized the litany of his own cruelties reflected back at him. For the first time, he was forced to confront the human cost of his pleasures, to see himself through the eyes of his victims rather than the flattering mirror of his own self-regard. That's just business," he whispered, the words sounding hollow even to his own ears. "It's the natural order. It's how things are supposed to be." "The natural order," Ezekiel mused, his tone almost philosophical. Yes, let's talk about the natural order. He gestured toward the hogs, who had begun pressing against the pen's rails with increasing urgency. Their usual docility had given way to something more primal, something that spoke to appetites older than civilization. They could smell the fear radiating from Grimwald's prone form, could sense the weakness that marked him as prey rather than predator. You see, Mr. Grimwald, you've spent your whole life talking about the natural order while living in complete defiance of it. You've convinced yourself that some men are born to own others, that cruelty is a divine right, that the strong have license to devour the weak without consequence. Ezekiel knelt beside his captive, his weathered face calm as carved stone. But the real natural order is simpler than that. It says that every action has consequences. It says that the cruel will eventually face cruelty, that the devourer will eventually be devoured. Today you're going to learn what that means. The hogs had grown increasingly agitated, their massive bodies creating tremors in the earth as they moved. They recognized the signs of feeding time even if the usual routines had been altered. Their small eyes gleamed with anticipation, and strings of saliva began to drip from their powerful jaws. Please, Grimwald whispered, the word torn from his throat like a confession under torture. Please, I'll do anything. I'll free everyone. I'll give you the plantation. You'll do nothing, Ezekiel interrupted, his voice carrying the finality of a judge pronouncing a sentence. Because you'll be dead, and the world will be better for it. Take a moment, if you will, to consider the profound questions raised by this moment of terrible justice. When legal systems fail, when society itself is structured to protect the oppressor, what remains but the ancient law of consequence? If these explorations of moral complexity in the face of ultimate suffering resonate with your understanding of justice, please subscribe and comment below. The actual feeding began with a precision that spoke to careful planning and intimate knowledge of the beast's habits. Ezekiel had spent years observing their behavior, had learned to read the signs that indicated peak hunger, had calculated exactly how to position his offering for maximum efficiency. Grimwald's protests grew weaker as the rope was adjusted, as he was maneuvered into position at the pen's edge. The hogs required no encouragement. They had been trained by years of routine to expect their meals at this location, and the scent of fresh meat triggered responses that were entirely instinctual. Their approach was methodical rather than frenzied, the behavior of creatures that had never known scarcity and therefore felt no need for haste. Grimwald's final moments were marked not by the dramatic speeches that characterized his public persona, but by the small, desperate sounds that all prey animals make when confronted with their mortality. His eyes, wide with the terrible understanding of what was happening, fixed on Ezekiel's face as if seeking some last-minute reprieve, some sign that this was merely an elaborate lesson rather than an execution. He found no mercy there. Ezekiel's expression remained as calm and impassive as it had been throughout the entire proceeding, showing no more emotion than a farmer might display while slaughtering a pig for Sunday dinner. This was not passion or revenge in any conventional sense. It was something far more elemental, the correction of an imbalance that had persisted for too long. The sounds that followed were not the screams one might expect, but something quieter and infinitely more disturbing. The efficient crunch of powerful jaws, the wet sound of consumption, the satisfied grunting of beasts experiencing the finest meal of their lives. The hogs went about their work with the same methodical thoroughness they brought to all their feeding, leaving no trace of what had been offered to them. Within an hour, it was finished. The pen contained nothing but a group of contented swine, their bellies full, their small eyes heavy with the satisfaction that comes after a particularly good meal. No evidence remained of what had transpired. No sign that Thaddeus Grimwald had ever existed beyond the gradually settling peace that seemed to descend over the plantation like a benediction. Ezekiel stood at the pen's rail for a long time, watching the hogs settle into their post-feeding lethargy. There was no triumph in his expression, no satisfaction or relief. He had not acted from emotion but from necessity, had served as an instrument of cosmic justice rather than personal vengeance. The universe had demanded a correction, and he had provided it. The plantation around him continued its morning routine, oblivious to the fundamental change that had just occurred. Slaves moved toward their assigned labors. Overseers took their positions. The machinery of forced agriculture continued its relentless operation. But something essential had shifted, Some balance had been restored. Some ancient law had finally been given its due. In the distance, a church bell tolled the hour, its bronze voice carrying across the bayou like a hymn of thanksgiving. The mockingbirds resumed their liquid songs. The cicadas returned to their eternal chorus, and the Spanish moss stirred in a breeze that seemed to carry whispers of approval from forces older than memory. The natural order had been restored. The cruel had been devoured, and the hogs, fat and content, slept peacefully in their pen, dreaming perhaps of the finest breakfast they had ever known. The hours that followed passed like scenes viewed through water, distorted and strangely distant, as if the world itself was still adjusting to the fundamental alteration that had occurred at the edge of the hog pen. Ezekiel moved through his remaining morning duties with the same mechanical precision that had marked his actions for decades. But beneath the familiar routines lay a hollow space where something essential had once resided. The deed was done, justice had been served, and yet he felt not satisfaction but a peculiar emptiness that seemed to echo in his chest like wind through an abandoned house. The plantation's rhythm continued undisturbed, its inhabitants unaware that their world had shifted on its axis. Slaves bent to their labors in the cotton fields. Overseers cracked their whips with casual brutality, and the great house loomed over it all with its customary air of malevolent authority. To any observer, Shadowmere appeared unchanged, still the same monument to human suffering it had always been. Only Ezekiel knew that its foundation had cracked, that the seemingly eternal structure of oppression had developed a fatal flaw. By noon, the sun had climbed high enough to bake the Louisiana landscape into shimmering submission, the air growing thick as soup and twice as oppressive. The hogs lay in the shade of their pen, their massive bodies slack with the contentment that follows a particularly satisfying meal. They showed no unusual behavior, no sign that their morning feeding had been anything other than routine. Their digestion was as efficient as their appetite, leaving no trace of what had transpired in the pre-dawn hours. It was Jeremiah Hooks who first noticed his employer's absence. The overseer had arrived at the great house for the daily noon conference, expecting to find Grimwald settled in his study with ledgers and correspondence, ready to discuss the afternoon's priorities and evening's entertainment. Instead, he found only empty rooms and an abandoned coffee cup on the veranda, its contents long since grown cold in the merciless heat. "Where's the master?" Hooks demanded of the house slaves, his scarred face twisted with the irritation of a man whose schedule had been disrupted. "He was supposed to meet with me an hour ago." The slaves could only shake their heads in genuine bewilderment. They had seen Grimwald emerge for his morning rounds as usual, had watched him disappear toward the far reaches of the plantation, but none could account for his failure to return. In 30 years of service, the master had never deviated from his established routines, had never missed an appointment or failed to appear for a scheduled meal. Hooks organized a search with the grim efficiency of a man accustomed to hunting runaway property. Overseers fanned out across the plantation grounds, their voices echoing through the humid air as they called Grimwald's name. They checked the stables, the cotton gin, the various outbuildings where business might have detained him. They questioned slaves who had been working in the areas of his usual morning route, demanding to know when each had last seen their master and in what direction he had been heading. The search party eventually made its way to the hog pen, where they found Ezekiel going about his afternoon feeding duties with his usual quiet competence. The massive beasts showed no interest in the additional slop he was distributing, their appetites apparently sated by some earlier bounty. This too struck the searchers as unremarkable. The hogs' eating habits had always been unpredictable, and their occasional disinterest in food was nothing new. "You saw Mr. Grimwald this morning?" Hooks asked, his eyes scanning the area for any sign of his missing employer. "Yes, sir," Ezekiel replied without looking up from his work. He came by during his morning rounds, maybe 9 o'clock. Looked at the hogs for a while, then headed off toward the bayou, said something about checking the property lines. It was a perfect lie delivered with the flat effect that whites expected from their human property. Hooks accepted it without question, his attention already turning toward the dense wilderness that bordered the plantation's cultivated areas. The bayou was dangerous territory, filled with quicksand, poisonous snakes, and alligators that could easily account for a missing man. If Grimwald had ventured too far into that green maze, he might never be found. The search continued for 3 days, expanding to include boats that probed the bayou's dark waters, and hunting parties that thrashed through the Spanish moss and cypress knees. They found nothing. No body, no torn clothing, no sign that Thaddeus Grimwald had ever existed beyond the gradually fading evidence of his presence in the great house. His coffee cup remained on the veranda table like a shrine to the vanished. His newspaper folded to the page of slave auction announcements he would never read again. By the end of the week, the authorities had arrived from New Orleans, grim-faced men in dark suits who asked probing questions and took careful notes. They interviewed every slave on the plantation, every overseer, every neighbor who might have seen or heard something unusual, but their investigation revealed nothing more than the original search had discovered. Thaddeus Grimwald had simply vanished, as completely as if the earth had opened up and swallowed him whole. The legal machinery that governed such situations ground into motion with ponderous inevitability. Grimwald's will was read, his assets catalogued, his human property evaluated for potential sale. The plantation would continue to operate under the supervision of a court-appointed administrator until such time as ownership could be properly transferred to distant relatives who had never set foot in Louisiana. For the slaves of Shadowmere, this transition brought neither freedom nor significant improvement in their circumstances. They were still property, still bound to the land by chains of law and custom, still subject to the casual cruelties that defined their existence. The only difference was that their new overseers lacked Grimwald's particular genius for psychological torture, his refined taste for inflicting precisely calibrated suffering. Temperance Wells gradually emerged from the hollow-eyed withdrawal that had marked her final days under Grimwald's direct attention. Color returned to her cheeks, strength to her voice, life to her eyes. She began to smile at her infant daughter again, began to sing the old songs that her mother had taught her before the rope claimed its own form of justice. She never asked what had happened to the master, never expressed curiosity about his mysterious disappearance. Some knowledge was too dangerous to possess, some questions too perilous to voice. As autumn gave way to winter and winter to spring, Shadowmere settled into new rhythms under new management. The cotton still grew, the slaves still labored, the machinery of bondage continued its relentless operation. But something fundamental had changed. Some essential element of terror had been extracted from the plantation's atmosphere. The new administrators were cruel enough in their own way, but they lacked the systematic sadism that had made Grimwald's rule a special kind of hell. Ezekiel continued his duties with the same mechanical precision he had always displayed, feeding the hogs twice daily, tending the gardens, repairing what needed repair. To external observation he remained unchanged, the same weathered face, the same resigned posture, the same apparent acceptance of his bondage. Only occasionally, when he thought himself unobserved, would something flicker behind his eyes that suggested depths no one suspected. The hogs thrived under his care, growing even larger and more contented than they had been under Grimwald's ownership. Visitors to the plantation often remarked on their size and apparent health, never guessing what had contributed to their particularly robust constitution. They remained efficient consumers, devouring whatever was placed before them with the same methodical thoroughness that had served them so well on that memorable morning. Years passed. The war came and went, bringing with it the collapse of the old order and the promise of freedom that proved more complicated than anyone had anticipated. Shadowmere changed hands several times, its human property scattered to the winds by the chaos of reconstruction. Some of its former slaves remained in Louisiana, some headed north in search of better prospects, and some simply disappeared into the vast anonymity of a disrupted world. Ezekiel was among those who vanished, slipping away one night like smoke dissipating in the wind. No one knew where he went or what became of him. Some said he headed for New Orleans. Others claimed to have seen him boarding a riverboat bound for the territories. A few whispered that he had returned to the bayou, had become one of those shadowy figures who lived in the spaces between the civilized and the wild. The truth was simpler and more complex than any of these theories. Ezekiel had indeed returned to the bayou, but not as a fugitive or exile. He had come home to a place where the old laws still held sway, where justice was not dependent on courts or legislation, but on the ancient balance between action and consequence. He found peace among the cypress and Spanish moss, found purpose in helping others who had suffered under the peculiar institution that had shaped his life. Travelers in the region, sometimes reported encounters with a mysterious figure who seemed to appear from nowhere when they were lost or threatened, who possessed an uncanny knowledge of the bayou's secrets and an equally mysterious ability to resolve problems that law enforcement could not touch. They described him as ageless, weathered by sun and wind, but possessed of eyes that held depths no ordinary man could claim. Those who knew the old stories, who remembered the tales passed down from slavery days, recognized him for what he had become. He was no longer Ezekiel Mourning, the broken slave who had endured 37 years of systematic brutalization. He had transformed into something else entirely, a force of nature, an agent of the cosmic balance that demanded all debts eventually be paid. The plantation itself gradually succumbed to the reclaiming power of the Louisiana wilderness. Without the constant labor required to maintain its cultivated spaces, Shadowmere began to return to the bayou from which it had been carved. Vines crept up the white columns, Spanish moss draped the roof like a funeral shroud, and the walls absorbed moisture until they became breeding grounds for the same rot that had always characterized the place's spiritual condition. The hog pen remained intact, longer than most structures, its sturdy wooden rails resisting decay with surprising persistence. For years after the plantation's abandonment, local hunters would occasionally report seeing massive swine roaming the area, descendants perhaps of Grimwald's prized beasts who had reverted to their wild nature. They were said to be unusually large and intelligent, possessed of an almost human cunning that made them formidable adversaries for any who attempted to hunt them. As we reach the end of this tale of justice delayed but not denied, take a moment to reflect on the enduring questions it raises about power, consequence, and the price of systematic cruelty. These stories from our darkest history remind us that evil, no matter how entrenched, ultimately contains the seeds of its own destruction. If this exploration of historical horror and natural justice has moved you to contemplate the moral complexities of our shared human experience, please subscribe and comment below. Share your thoughts on this tale of terrible necessity and join the conversation about the lessons history offers to those willing to listen. On quiet nights, when the moon hung full over the Louisiana bayou and the Spanish moss stirred in breezes that seemed to carry whispers from the past, old-timers claimed they could still hear the sound of feeding. Not the gentle munching of domestic animals, but something more primal, more purposeful, the sound of ancient hunger being satisfied, of cosmic debts being collected, of the natural order asserting itself against those who had tried to bend it to their will. The bayou remembered everything, they said. It remembered the screams and the silence, the cruelty and the justice, the feeding and the fed. And sometimes, on those moonlit nights when the boundary between past and present grew thin, it would share those memories with anyone brave enough to listen. The hogs were sleeping now, fat and content in their eternal feast. The cruel had been devoured, the balance restored, the ancient law fulfilled. And somewhere in the green depths of the Louisiana wilderness, Ezekiel Mourning continued his patient work, ensuring that those who forgot the lessons of Shadowmere would receive their own reminders of what happened when the natural order was finally allowed to reassert itself. The bayou was waiting, as it had always waited, and it was very, very hungry.